Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I'm honored to be the host of this podcast series. Today, our guest is Mark Bergman, the founder and CEO of 7 Pillars Global Insights. We will explore his career and what got him to the work that he's currently doing. So welcome, Mark.
Now, thank you very, very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
So let's start with your law firm career, because you spent decades at Paul Weiss. Tell me about that.
So I started at Paul Weiss in 1982. I expect to spend 2 or 3 years at most, and then come back to Washington and join the Foreign Service or have a more public-oriented legal career. I spent a fair amount of time overseas. My father was a diplomat. I have a master's degree in international law, so I thought, spend a few years getting some experience and then come back and apply it in an international law context. And that was law of the sea, law of space, and the like. And little did I know that that would stick with me for a while. 39 years later, I was still there. I stepped down 2 years ago. In the interim, I had to spend a fair amount of time in New York. I was in our Paris office twice, both as an associate and as a partner. I then, shortly before 9/11, had the green light from the firm to open and run our office in London, which I did shortly after 9/11. And so ran the Paul Weiss office for 20 years. I was also head of our global securities and capital markets practice. So I essentially, at a firm that was, or a corporate department that was very much a group of generalists, far more focused on securities and capital markets work. By the mid-90s, the firm had moved to, at least corporate department had moved to a more specialized approach to delivery of legal practice, and I was there at the foundation of our securities group, and spent much of the 25 years, or the latter part of my career, taking companies public all over the world. So I was an SEC lawyer first and foremost. I was a disclosure lawyer, and that will be important for how I eventually got into the climate side of ESG. But having focused largely on taking companies public from the company side, I also developed the sidelines around corporate governance. Mm-hmm. And that came together in an interesting way because I also loved writing. I was editor-in-chief of my law review, and that just carried on. In fact, I published articles early on as a first and second year associate in law reviews. I calculated that I had published probably 450 alerts on the Paul Weiss website.
Wow.
And that will also tie into the climate aspect of the ESG practice. So took companies public, corporate governance, cross-border. There were any number of other issues that would have come into that M&A. So I had quite a broad practice over that 39 years.
And so that brings us, my guess is it brings us right to founding 7 Pillars Global Insights. Tell me about that, how that happened, and what that entity focuses on.
Once I stepped down, there were a number of things that I wanted to continue to do. So I hesitate to use the word retire. I have not retired. I have a full day. It's a global practice. And in a sense, I haven't fully figured out what I want to do when I grow up. But the prime driver for 7 Pillars was I needed a home for my thought leadership. And going back to the alerts that I had prepared over time, and those alerts were largely, though not exclusively, around securities law topics, because I was in London and present for Brexit. we published a number of pieces on Brexit and what that means for cross-border capital flows and the like. But I also had, outside of Paul Weiss, I wrote for and spoke on topics of corporate governance for the conference board.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, just shortly after the fall of Lehman Brothers, come up with a template that was intended to be used by chief legal officers and boards of directors as a checklist of things that they needed to be thinking about. And so that very first set of bullet points over the weekend, or just as Lehman Brothers was collapsing way back, whenever that was, in 2008, I came up with a 4 or 5 page list of bullet points that I, as a director of a public company, would want to understand from my management come Monday or Tuesday. And so I use that template for a variety of other themes, including cyber, including sort of cross-border issues around political risk. And so it was not a surprise to me that it would eventually also morph into ESG. But as far as 7 Pillars is concerned, that first and foremost was a place where I could collect my thought leadership pieces. Today, that my website has probably over 100 different briefing notes. Mm-hmm. I prepare briefing notes because that's how I learn. And in fact, if I think back to many of the articles that the alerts, the securities alerts that I prepared, and in contrast to others, for the longest time, I wrote them myself. If somebody else wrote them, and as we move to a more defined knowledge management group, we would have 1 or 2 people that drafted the alerts. They could always expect significant comments from me. Not necessarily as critique, but rather I had a view of how alerts should be written because I wanted them to be user-friendly. I wanted them to provide the readers, whether they were general counsel, whether they were CFOs, whether they were bankers, whoever the audience was, what does this mean for me? Mm-hmm. And so that continues to my briefing notes now. So I, in effect, am giving people the benefit of what I have learned. And so I have carried over from my law review days, instead of citations, boy, life would have been so much easier had we had the internet back then. It is full of links to other things. So I'm giving people the benefit of my research. And so again, first and foremost, it's a unifying place. And it also helps because, as you can appreciate, in the working world, people want to know where you come from. Mm-hmm. They'd like to see a business card, even though now my business card's digital. So that was the genesis for the 7 Pillars.
So you mentioned the template that you created as Lehman Brothers was collapsing and the financial crisis was coming upon us. I would be curious from your perspective, how many of those bullet points are actually part of what we would consider ESG today? So first, let's address that. And then secondly, how did you capture all of your career experience and expertise into the ESG? Yeah.
It's a very good question. Thank you. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but thinking about it now, it's very much about governance. Mm-hmm. And some of my early pieces track through the difference between board oversight, so risk oversight, and risk management. And if I were to step back from my informal business development outreach, it was to inform my targets, my readers, about issues that they needed to know about, that they may not have had time to think about. Today, it's called horizon scanning. I've heard that term, at least I heard that term in London 3 or 4 times in the last few days while I was there. And it is recognizing that our clients, the people that we interact with, are hugely, hugely sophisticated. And they're hugely sophisticated with that which they are tasked with doing, that which their companies are naturally focused on. When you overlay how busy people are with the complexities of the world today and the world even post-financial crisis, being able to cut through and attempt to give people a frame of reference for the issues that are relevant. And in a sense, that's governance. So what should we as directors be thinking about and testing, stress testing, inquiring of management? And so some of the pieces I wrote were for management. Some of the most interesting briefings and roundtables that I led were with chief risk officers. And so taking, because of additional interests that I have, I'm associated still with two of the UK's foreign policy and defense think tanks. I spent not an insignificant amount of time getting to know what today people call business intelligence firms. So it's all about risk. And so going back to those bullet points, that really is the G. How do we govern? To the second part of your question, about, let's see, in 2019, a very close personal friend of ours, my wife and mine, is the Financial Times journalist Gillian Tett. And Gillian was one of the few to have written about and alerted the world to the looming global financial crisis. And so we stayed in touch, and she wrote a piece in September. She had a weekly column in the Financial Times magazine, which in effect said that the next financial crisis could be because the 30-year mortgage will be underwater. And by that, she meant that most mortgages had a 30-year timeline. And if you thought about when people had purchased houses, and then you overlaid the risk of climate change, in particular flooding, what would that do if we saw Superstorm Sandys and on, what would that do to the financial markets? So having learned that when Gillian writes something, I should pay attention, I realized that I hadn't focused sufficiently on ESG as a practice area. I had focused on sustainability because my principal client was one of the world's leading reinsurers and one of the world's leading Europe-based reinsurers who have been out in front on sustainability now for some time. And as a disclosure lawyer, as a corporate governance advisor, that the sustainability disclosure I found fascinating, but I hadn't really put the two together until I read the piece. So I spent 150 some hours trying to understand where the world was in ESG and assumed that it's always best to lead with your strengths. And that strength was, at the end of the day, I'm a disclosure lawyer. I'm an SEC lawyer, but I was also what was the FCA, then the FCA in the UK, and the BaFin in Germany. And so these were concepts that came quite naturally to me. And I also had the privilege of knowing senior people in places. So I could begin to put all of that together. And that culminated in my focus on the climate aspects and particularly what that means for businesses, what that means for boards of directors, what it means for management, and have ridden that since. So in contrast to others that have come to ESG via the S, the social, or others, the G, I set out to become a subject matter expert on climate-related disclosures. So the TCFD, what the EU has been doing, what the UK is doing, and what the SEC had first been doing, and then the proposed rules that came out when they did. And I have written since then on developments in the area, always noting that the US is still behind and will have to catch up in a big way. But I also have, having had the benefit of sitting in London for 20 years, recognized the importance, or where in the firmament global regulation sits. And by this, I mean in particular the EU. I was present really at the creation of the GDPR. I had a conversation just last week with a former EMEA general counsel of one of the platforms, who is a terrific authority on privacy and the like. And we were reminded of the fact that up until maybe 2-3 months before the GDPR kicked in, most people in this country hadn't really focused on it. And the message there was that for the longest time in the global disclosure, the global regulatory space, people needed to understand what the US was doing. They needed to understand the SEC. They needed to understand the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They needed to understand a variety of, in the ABC world of, business conduct, what the US was doing because of the long arm of US jurisdiction writ large. But now here we had a different example. We had the Europeans coming up with what a law professor at Columbia has termed the Brussels effect, which is having to comply simply because you do business in various places. And that, by the way, is, as you know, we now have California.
I was just going to ask you.
We'll shortly have in California when the governor signs that. So the lesson, one of the things that I undertook to do, or much of what I undertake to do, is to raise awareness. And so the awareness in this case was to remind people, just as I did when GDPR first came out, that even though you're sitting outside of the European Union, and now that also includes the United Kingdom, that there are significant legal and regulatory developments that built on that. The Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act is yet another, and we, as your listeners will know, are way behind on privacy legislation and the like. I was just on a phone call with the threats of AI posed to any number of things. And so the world has changed in that respect, that we need to be looking elsewhere to know who's setting the standard, the gold standard, if you will, around these types of things. So that's, I think that's how it all kind of pulls together.
So you mentioned two things that I want to explore a little further: the California regulations, the forthcoming regulations, and we're recording this in early October. So we're all on pins and needles wondering when the SEC regs are going to be issued.
Yes. Give
me your thoughts on both and your predictions with respect to the SEC regulations, timing as well as content.
Well, taking Florida first, what was interesting, and I, when I did my piece on the California legislation, what was interesting was that it does have the equivalent of extraterritorial effect. In other words, you don't have to be headquartered in California, and the revenue tests are not determined by the revenue allocable to or attributable to California, but rather it's global. It could be US revenue, it could be global revenue, and the like. And so was also interested to read in maybe the equivalent of the legislative history, the projections of the number of companies that would be subject at the higher threshold. It's 5,000 6, 7, 800, and at the lower threshold for the TCFD financial risk disclosure is about 10,000 companies. The other thing that was interesting about California is that it goes further than the SEC. Both bills apply to both public and private companies, and the first of the two, having to do with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, is stricter than the expected disclosure that will come out of the SEC. So I was struck by the fact that, even as somebody who has been following this relatively closely, I must say I hadn't really focused on California. I should have, but didn't. And that we're just waiting for it to be signed. The governor, at least on various occasions, has indicated he will have signed it. I've been out of the country for a week, and he may even have signed it since then. Now, the SEC, I hesitate to predict. I hesitate to predict because of the amount of pushback that the SEC has received, both from industry as well as from the political realm, which the Europeans had far less of. And it is not that the EU effort has been without its hiccups and without its speed bumps, if you will, but by and large, they set out a very comprehensive Green Deal. And they also, interestingly, started with, what is the end goal? If the end goal is the Paris agreements, if it is net zero by 2050, what do we need to do to get there? And what we need to do to get there involves a whole of society, or at least a whole of business approach that requires, or whose components are institutional investors, as well as those that allocate money. It's the pension fund. So it's across the spectrum, in contrast to the SEC approach, which just focuses on, not surprisingly, given the SEC's mandate, on SEC reporting companies, domestic and foreign private issuers. So the SEC effort is far narrower, in a sense, than the global efforts. It focuses on climate as opposed to sustainability, which the Europeans have focused on. And sustainability, by the way, will eventually even capture supply chain audits, human rights under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And one would have thought that with a narrower effort, it would have moved forward with alacrity, but that's not the way things are done here. And then again, we unfortunately, I think it's hugely unfortunate, have this political overlay that fails, in my own view, to recognize that ESG is good for business. And all of the tropes and whatever else kind of misread. And if you speak to investors, again, the institutional investors, the institutional money, there are can be quibbles over at the details. And again, the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 greenhouse gas is an example of that. But that, ultimately, this is good for business. And I'll give you maybe a different data point, which is, I'm also hugely involved in Democratic politics, and so followed the legislative accomplishments of the Biden administration, including the Inflation Reduction Act, with $369 billion available in tax credits and subsidies for that transition to net zero, if you will. Interestingly, in Europe, all people are talking about is the IRA. They want, in order for them to take advantage of the so-called Buy America provisions, what I call a Buy America, they are coming here to set up. And even young people, I spoke to various young people. I said, what are you thinking of doing? And they're saying, we are thinking of doing tech startups. We're very focused on sustainability. Oh, where are you going to do that? Well, there's only one place to do that. It's the United States.
Mhm. So in that respect, we might actually be leading.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
certainly on the regulatory respect, we are lagging very, very far behind.
Yeah.
But I'm also of the opinion, and you touched on this, regardless of what the SEC issues,
Yeah.
so many US companies are already under the realm of
Yes.
other regulatory requirements that it almost, I don't want to say this because it seems extreme, but it almost doesn't matter what the SEC does now, because if you do business anywhere in Europe or in the UK, you will likely have to comply. And I also will say this, that all businesses are part of somebody else's supply chain.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so it hits all of us,
Sure.
regardless of what the SEC.
That last point is a critical one, because one person's scope 3 is another person's scopes 1 and 2.
Yep.
And that and this comes to the broader ESG with the S, which is that we've moved away from the idea of, shareholder value. It's far broader. And so take whether it was the withdrawal of businesses out of Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, the concerns, and I've been on countless calls recently around those that are trying to track how exposed businesses would be to China, invasion of Taiwan, and the like. And so it's tough. It is hugely tough to be a director of a public company these days for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that there are issues that coming at them every direction, which some were natural and some aren't, particularly in the whole politicization of business and of ESG. And so whether it's employees, whether it's lenders, whether it's insurance companies, whether it is institutional investors, for whom the success or failure of the transition, mitigation, and adaptation. But the other interesting thing is that I focused on this early on, which was, as lawyers, we tend to look at the downside. What are the risks? But the numbers associated with the opportunities presented by that inevitable move to net zero, however defined, those who have recognized that and are moving away, they are ignoring all of the noise around woke. They're just moving forward. And I would hope, and here's sort of a message for the law firm audience, that lawyers could begin to they could play a greater role, which right now is far more benefiting consultants, the accounting firms. Is to the extent that one continues to approach this as, what are the risks? What are the risks? They're there. If the CEO in her presentation talks about aspiration, but the reality is very, very different. Yes, there are huge liability issues. And when we get to disclosure, I think there will be a significant mismatch between the rules and the ability to comply with the rules.
Yes, yes.
And that the skill set will be those that have the subject matter expertise that can understand and will have read the greenhouse gas protocols, that will understand. And here, this is the benefit of the EU that's been at this now since 2017, understanding TCFD. What are they getting at? And pretty soon they'll see, risk management, risk oversight, board, strategy, risk. What it means is the lawyers will have to step out of a comfort zone. It's to go back. If you think you asked about my legal career, for the longest time we were business advisors, right? And then we became transactional lawyers, and it's just get the transaction done. But if you think back to the greats of the profession that have sort of sustained themselves over time, they were corporate governance people, they were business advisors, as well as disclosure lawyers, which means judgment.
Yeah.
All of those things, I think, will be critical in order to play a hugely important role in helping companies navigate these waters.
So that leads me to our final question. In this complex environment with politics and regulations and the way society is behaving right now, is there anything that gives you hope?
Yes. What gives me hope is that there's a huge political overlay to all of this. But I think that people understand climate change. They understand the impacts. All they have to do is look around, and that they are beginning to make the connection between what life used to be like and what life is now, and making decisions about where they live and how they are insured and any number of things. And so I'd like to think that that will serve to mitigate some of the political resistance. And the other is a recognition that we need to be at the center in all of this. We can't today simply turn off all of the fossil fuel taps, for example. So people are becoming more educated, or I think are willing to be more flexible in their views as to what needs to be done. And that, public opinion is hugely important. The other thing that gives me hope are young people. And young people are hugely focused on the planet and what we are bequeathing to them or not bequeathing to them. And they're using their voice. And it is that voice that cannot be ignored by political world any more than the business world.
Right.
And so when you certainly put that together, you'll have this, grassroots, if you will, this from the bottom up saying these things are important.
Yeah.
And so again, whether it's a social justice issue, the S, or companies doing the right thing, I'd love to. I have my own checklist of things that I'd like to see changes. And we're also in a very fraught political environment right now. And I'd like to think, and this gives me hope, that businesses are recognizing that they have a stake in the outcomes of the issues that confront us,
Yes.
whether you flame it as democracy or otherwise. And so I try to be optimistic.
You are hopeful. And what I'd like to do is have you back a year from now, and we'll assess where we are and the progress that has been made over the next 12 months. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Your insights have been invaluable.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the opportunity particularly because it's always good to stress test why you think what you think and where it's going. And so even with some of your questions, I will have food for thought between now and this time next year.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.